The cemetery woke with the city slowly, cautiously, like an old door easing open so as not to disturb the house. The sky over the live oaks was still a pale, rinsed gray when Eleanor Whitmore stepped from her car, closed the door with a soft click, and gathered her bouquet. White lilies, as always. Richard had liked their clean lines and the way they kept their secrets. She walked the stone path in her low black heels, shoulders straight, the posture of a woman who had learned long ago how to carry weight without showing the strain of it. Eleanor had a ritual. Every Friday, 8 o'clock, a quiet visit, a brief prayer, a private update spoken under her breath, about the markets, about the museum endowment, about her sister's arthritis, and the azaleas that refused to bloom on the south side of the terrace. She came alone and left alone. In the Whitmore universe, grief was a private room with a single chair. That morning the room was occupied. A boy was kneeling at Richard's grave, not a man too narrow-shouldered, too much of childhood still clinging to the jawline, and yet not a child either. Old enough to carry a kind of sorrow that had settled, not like a summer storm, but like a season. His hoodie had dark spots where the grass's dew had kissed it. In his hands, he held not florists' lilies, but a handful of wild things. Queen Anne's lace, clover, a daisy with a bruised petal, as if he had gathered the roadside itself in an armful and brought it here. Eleanor stopped. A stranger at her husband's name. A stranger with eyes wet enough to make the letters blur in her sight. "Excuse me," she said, arranging her voice into its coolest setting. "You're at the wrong headstone." The boy looked up. His gaze was not defiant. It was simply present steady, honest in the way eyes are when there's nothing left to protect. "No, ma'am," he said. "Mr. Whitmore. He helped me." Eleanor's lips parted for a reply that arrived late and wrong. "You must be mistaken." "My husband." The boy let the words pass by like a train he had decided not to board. "He was more than you think," he said, and set the wild bouquet against the polished granite as gently as a hand to a forehead. When he walked away, he did not look back. For a while, Eleanor could not move. She stood with the lilies in a firm fist, as if someone might try to take them. The air smelled of cut grass and damp stone. Somewhere nearby, a maintenance cart buzzed. A bird yanked at a worm and then changed its mind. When she finally knelt, her knee clicked in a way that reminded her of birthdays. She placed the lilies beside the boy's wild flowers and could not avoid the comparison. Hers were perfect. His were true. All that day the sentence nested behind her ribs. He was more than you think. It refused to be reasoned with. It turned itself over, found new angles, made itself at home among the old photographs and bronze plaques, and framed invitations that had always felt like the inventory of a life well lived. Richard Whitmore, builder, donor, honored guest, guest of honor, had been a man who left marks that plaques could name. Eleanor had stood at his side for 42 years, and if she had not always understood his quiet, she had come to trust the shape of it. That night, the quiet kept her awake. At 2:14, she rose and walked the wide hallways of the house she now wandered, as if in a museum whose curator had died. In the library, Richard's territory, all leather and smoke-washed oak, she pulled a photo album down and turned pages that, for the first time, felt like display more than memory. She saw herself in shimmering fabrics and careful hair. She saw Richard holding a crystal tumbler, his smile small and practiced. She saw the governors and the chairman and the hospital wing engraving his name into good marble. She tried to hold the boy's face against these images like tracing paper over ink. At 4:17, she gave up and made coffee. At 4:23, she called George. George had been Whitmore counsel since the 80s, and his voice carried that decade still. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, awake at once the way men who serve old money learn to be. "Did Richard make any private donations?" she asked. "Not the foundation work, not the opera, not the museum. I mean smaller, anonymous." The word was unfamiliar in her mouth. George rustled papers that didn't need rustling. "We've no record of anything like that," he said carefully, "outside of what you oversaw." Of course not, she thought, and hated herself for the of course. She had managed their giving with the precision of a jeweler, had weighed it on scales, had yesed and noed with a pen made of the kind of gold that knew its place. Anonymous was not a column on the spreadsheet. Anonymous made for poor seating charts. She hung up. The house regarded her in its permanent calm. She went to the closet where Richard had kept a small wall safe, not the one for the jewels and bonds, but the one for documents no one should see without the particular permission of a quiet man. She typed their wedding date, wondering if the code would feel like a prophecy if it did not work. It opened. Inside, an old cigar that had gone to dust, a fountain pen Richard had carried since the first company he built on money that had been more hunger than capital, and a small stack of envelopes bound with twine. Her hands did not shake so much as they moved slower than she wished, like someone learning to handle a newborn after a long decade without babies. She read. A letter from a public school principal that had been typed on paper paid for by bake sales and faith. "We wouldn't have kept the tutoring program without the anonymous gift. Please tell your friend that 10 boys now reading 2 grade levels higher owe him more than thanks." A crayon card, the kind young hands make when an adult has told them gratitude can be drawn. "Thank you for the notebooks. I didn't know my name looked good on paper till today." A folded flyer for a neighborhood youth center called Brookview. At the bottom, in Richard's unshowy hand, a schedule. Tuesdays, 3B to 4 p.m., writing, 5 p.m., reading group. And beneath that, a list of first names with arrows and notes. Dexter Arrow short stories, good ear. Terrence, math gaffes, visual memory. Malik, quiet, watchful. Tell him that's strength. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, like a girl expecting a scolding. Richard Whitmore, who had found galas tiresome but necessary, had been slipping out on Tuesday afternoons to a room numbered like an apartment and painted, she imagined, like a school dreams itself when it has no money. It might still have been nothing more than curiosity, if not for the way that last note had been written. Not like a donor tracking investment, but like a man remembering children he had come to know by the stories they were hiding. She went back to the cemetery 2 days later because she could not think of anything else to do. She told herself she was being prudent, that she must confirm before building a new world out of receipts. But what she wanted was less sensible and more human. The boy again, the one who had carried truth into her ordered morning and left with it. He was there, not at the grave this time, but on a bench under a live oak whose roots had begun to undress the lawn. He had a notebook open on his knees and was writing the way people write when no one has told them their handwriting should be ashamed. Eleanor sat on the far end of the bench. For a while they listened to the same birds. "You came back," he said, not as a welcome but as a fact. "I don't like questions that don't end," she answered, and was startled at how close the sentence came to confession. "What's your name?" Malik, he said. Malik Carter. He did not offer his hand, and she did not take offense. She did not know how to talk to grief in a hoodie. "Did you know my husband?" she asked. "Truly, I mean, not just—" She gestured in a way that made the word charity seem vulgar. "Not just as a check." Malik closed the notebook carefully, like a door on a sleeping baby. "He was the first white man who ever believed me when I said I could be more than what my street said I was," he said. "He didn't give me a speech. He asked what I was writing, and when I told him it was dumb, he said, 'So what? All first drafts are dumb. That's how you know you're headed somewhere.' Then he came back the next week. The next week. The phrase lodged in her like a pebble in a shoe. Small, incessant. She had always thought of Richard's time as something to be budgeted in units that purchased rooms and deals and influence. She had never thought of his hours as something he might spend secretly on boys who did not know their names, looked good in ink. "Brookview?" she asked, trying the word like a password. Malik nodded. "Room 3B Tuesdays. Every Tuesday. Even the one when the rain came sideways and the bus driver said only fools and fishermen were out." In the Whitmore house, rain had been a calendar note and a caterer's complaint. Eleanor sat with that difference. The quiet opened between them again, not awkward but alive. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked. And when Malik did not answer, she said it again, softer, to herself this time. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Maybe he thought you wouldn't understand," Malik said finally, and the sentence landed like a hand placed on a shoulder rather than a slap. Eleanor drove to Brookview the next day, in a car she had never driven herself on a route she had never taken. The city changed its face a dozen blocks from the square where the tourists came to photograph moss and haunted houses. The sidewalks grew narrower and carried more children at once. The storefronts had signs that had been painted by cousins. In a vacant lot, a mural of a woman reading a book covered a wall with flowers made of words. The front desk at Brookview was a painted table with a jar of pens, a bell that had lost its clang, and a woman with a smile that could have sold sunlight. "Can I help you?" she asked, already halfway there. "Room 3B, Eleanor said. I believe my husband volunteered here." She felt like a fraud pronouncing the verb. "Mr. Whitmore?" the woman said, the name out of context making Eleanor feel like an imposter at her own life. "He was one of our best," the woman added. "Showed up like a clock that chose kids instead of hours." Room 3B was down a hall whose paint had surrendered in places but still sang. Inside, she found hand-drawn posters with quotes spelled out in the laborious block letters of boys biting their tongues with concentration. "Believe in me before the world condemns me. My mentor, my mirror." There were photos, too, printed with the cheap ink that gives new eyes to old things. In one, Richard had a laugh halfway to his mouth. Eleanor had to sit down because she had never seen that expression on him in all the pictures framed in gilt she had paid for. A leader materialized at her elbow, the way grace does sometimes when it notices you noticing. "He loved this room," the woman said. "Said it reminded him of the library where he started getting good at keeping his own counsel." "Why, didn't he—" Eleanor began, and knew the absurdity even as she asked it. Richard had been a man who did what the moment called for without turning it into a speech. She could not decide if she was angry at being excluded or grateful that not everything needed her signature. On the bulletin board, among the essays laminated with the tender pragmatism of people who protect what they value with plastic and hope, she found a piece by M. Carter. The man who made me write my name without shame. She read how a boy had folded himself small enough to fit the expectations of a world that kept measuring him for a box, and how an older man had simply sat in a chair and said, "Keep writing." There were no metaphors in the piece that couldn't walk into the room. Back at the house that night, the portrait over the fireplace, Richard in his tuxedo, Eleanor in navy satin, the painter blessed with the talent for disguising boredom as elegance looked suddenly like a performance frozen mid-bow long after the audience had left. She climbed the stairs and found, in a drawer that had become a museum of paper clips and old calculator tape, a black notebook of her own she had not written in since 1998. She opened to a clean page. "I saw him today in a photograph where his mouth remembered laughter," she wrote. "I have been a careful wife. I have not been a curious one." The next Tuesday, she returned to Brookview. She felt conspicuous in her plain coat, in shoes that were meant for floors without carpets. Malik appeared from 3B, as if called by a bell she had not rung. He wore the same hoodie, or one like it, and a confidence that did not yet know to call itself that. "Would you have tea?" she asked, and realized she had not invited anyone into her house since the funeral who did not speak in polite fonts. He shifted, as if weighing an exit. "Tea?" he repeated, the word comical and foreign and a bridge. "All right. If there's sugar, there can be sugar." In the Whitmore kitchen, silence had historically been something catered. Now it found a new job. Eleanor set out cups she had inherited and had never filled herself. Malik added 3 spoonfuls of sugar and called it a beginning. She placed lemon cookies between them as if muffins could negotiate peace. She did not speak first. Malik told her about Brookview, how Tuesdays had become a line on his week that could steady the others, how writing something he could sign made him feel seen, how Mr. Whitmore had carried a pen that looked like it could sign treaties and used it to check his spelling without making anyone small. Eleanor listened in a way she had forgotten she knew how. "Why didn't you come to the funeral?" she asked at last, surprising herself with the intimacy of the question. Malik's eyes traveled the room like a man deciding where to sit at a table where he is not sure he belongs. "It looked like a room for people who knew him with money," he said finally. "I knew him with Tuesdays." She nodded, the truth so clean it hurt. "I would have wanted you there," she said, fully aware of how late the sentence arrived to the day in question. "He wouldn't," Malik said, not to be unkind, but to be accurate. He didn't like rooms where people clap for the wrong thing. They did not fight that. Instead, they began to build a small thing in its place, a plan that was as simple as a door. A scholarship named for a room instead of a man. A mentorship that did not require a black-tie dinner to begin. A way to take the hours Richard had smuggled out of the Whitmore calendar and multiply them. They called it Project 3B because names should remind us of where to show up. Eleanor brought down from her library a leather folder in which she had stored the possibility of doing what money is for. She slid it across the table to Malik, who touched the cover as if it might be fragile. "I don't want to build a new wing anywhere," Eleanor said. "I want to build a Tuesday that doesn't end." He smiled without showing teeth. "I can help with that," he said, and the sentence fixed something in her that had been off its hinge. The first weeks were simple and so beautiful they felt like a trick. Eleanor went to Brookview with a notebook and a pen whose nib made a small singing noise. Malik led the writing group while she sat at the side and learned that sentences make different faces in boys afraid to be seen. She met Dexter, who wrote dialogue better than he spoke, Terrence, who made mistakes in math the way people who see images before numbers do, and a small cluster of kids forever deciding whether they were brave enough to be noticed. Eleanor learned the school's schedule. She learned the bus times. She learned the names of the mothers who worked 2 jobs and still arrived with a casserole for a fundraiser because they understood community the way the wealthy understand tax law. She learned that the kettle in the 3B cupboard sputtered on its way to boil, and that patience could be measured in those seconds. She learned her city's other map. At home, the house conceded to new sounds. Footsteps in the west hall that did not belong to a butler. Laughter in the kitchen that did not keep itself neat. One Thursday, she found Malik at the dining table helping a child named Noel draft an application for a summer program that expected to find only certain names on its forms. "Write your name large," Malik coached. "Let them feel the edges of it." When Eleanor told this story to herself later, she noticed it without embroidery. She was not in the center of the frame. It had taken her 68 years to like that feeling. People asked questions, as people do. At the country club, a friend leaned across a linen tablecloth and said, "Ellie, dear, I hear you're doing outreach?" The word had too many vowels and a cough lodged inside it. "Is that safe?" the friend asked, not bothering to define the referent of that. Eleanor sipped her tea and thought of Tuesdays and boys who put sugar in it the way hope goes into a day, generously, unashamed. "It's necessary," she said, and surprised herself with how gentle she sounded. George called to ask how the new structure should be formalized. "Quietly," Eleanor said. "Make it efficient, make it clean, but keep it small enough to feel. This one is not for plaques." She threw a small garden behind the carriage house because Malik had said kids wrote better when they could pull a carrot from the ground and remember that patience is edible. She planted daisies there too, because daisies reminded her of a morning she had learned that wild things have a grammar money cannot teach. On an afternoon, the sky forgot how to rain, and then remembered suddenly. Malik arrived with a bag of used books he had rescued from a library sale. Baldwin and Angelou, and a mystery novel that had no business teaching structure as well as it did. He placed them on the table with the pride of a man setting down heirlooms. "I've been trying to write about him," he said, not looking up from the stack of spines. "About Mr. Whitmore." He laughed softly. "But every sentence turns into a speech." "Then write about Tuesdays," Eleanor said, and saw the relief pass over his face like shade in summer. They returned to the cemetery together the next morning because some circles must be closed where they began. Eleanor carried sunflowers because light belongs where it can be seen. Malik carried daisies from the garden he had helped plant behind a house that had been quiet too long. They knelt without speaking. She placed the sunflowers against the Whitmore name. He set the daisies beside the lily that had gone brittle and beautiful. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and took out the fountain pen from the safe. She held it in her palm like a bird she had nursed and was ready to release. "He used this to sign every deal," she said, "and also to check your spelling, I'm told." Malik laughed. It was a small sound. The kind grief makes when it remembers joy does not betray it. "I'm not him," he said, as if he needed to warn her. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm giving it to you." She placed the pen in his hand. "Use it for Tuesdays." They stayed until the dew climbed back into the air. On the way to the car, Malik reached for her hand. She took it. The gesture was not symbolic. It was human. In the fall, Project 3B sent its first 3 students into a city that had not expected them. Dexter won a small prize for a story that made adults ache without knowing why. Terence discovered geometry could look like the sketch in his head. Noel got into the summer program and wrote Eleanor a postcard from a campus whose catalog had never pictured him. He signed his name in the largest letters the card could hold. At Christmas, the Whitmore dining room hosted a potluck that confused the silver. A table that had held quiet conversations about tax strategy now bore mac and cheese that had memorized generations and a sweet tea that could have been declared a controlled substance. Eleanor wore a red sweater someone had told her made her look less like an heiress and more like someone's aunt. She laughed and meant it. There were setbacks. One of the boys went missing for 3 days into a trouble he had believed would make him taller. He returned smaller and angry. Eleanor and Malik took turns sitting on the porch of his mother's apartment with a thermos and the kind of silence that invites confession. Another boy's father didn't like that his son liked to read. "Books won't put food on the table," he said. And Eleanor, who had never wondered about food on a table in her life, felt the shame of the learning curve in her bones. She learned to say, "Books will show your boy where the good work lives," and then to help him find a job that didn't use up all the daylight in his head. On a Tuesday that had not begun kindly, Eleanor found in the bottom of her handbag a small black notebook she had been filling with unshowy sentences. She wrote while the boys bent over their pages. "I thought love died with the body. Now I know love simply changes address." She had not intended to become that sort of woman, the kind who wrote in notebooks without irony. But grief has a way of turning private rooms into classrooms. She let it. 1 year to the week after the mourning at the grave, Eleanor returned there with Malik again. The cemetery looked the same, and she was not. She knelt on a knee that no longer complained because she had made peace with the noise. She thanked the man she had married and the stranger she had missed. She thanked the boy who had taught her how to go looking where she had never thought to look. They stayed a long time. When at last they walked back to the car, the air had the feeling of a place that had yielded a secret with relief at finally being asked. On the drive home, Malik turned the pen in his hand. "I figured out how to write about him," he said. "You were right. I wrote about Tuesdays." "Can I read it?" Eleanor asked. "Not yet," he said, smiling. "First I have to read it to the boys who think they don't have Tuesdays coming." "Fair." He looked out the window at a city that still kept 2 maps in its pocket. "He would have liked this," he said. "Not the fuss." "The work, he didn't like applause," Eleanor said, and then, after a small pause, "Neither do I. I like results." He laughed. "You're changing." "I'm arriving," she said, and listened to the sentence echo in her like a key in the right lock. The Whitmore house learned new habits over the next seasons. The front door developed a creak as if to warn them that children were coming with their noise and their truth. The pantry acquired snack foods that come in bags that crinkle and remind you that joy can be purchased in humble quantities. The garage surrendered a bay to donated bicycles. A small corner of the library gave up its obsession with first editions and welcomed a lending shelf with a sign in Malik's hand. Take, read, return, or don't. Just keep reading. The board of the museum sent a letter requesting a statement about the family's charitable priorities going forward. Eleanor dictated it into George's patience. It was a paragraph long and included the word Tuesdays. It did not include the word legacy. Legacy belonged to rooms with fewer chairs. On a humid evening when the sun refused to let go of the day, Eleanor and Malik sat on the back steps and watched the boys chase each other with a ball whose trajectory disobeyed physics. The garden hummed with the life people mean when they say the word community without the courage to practice it. Eleanor felt Richard's absence the way she sometimes felt the ache in her shoulder before the rain. Not painful now, but announcing something. She did not try to silence it. She had learned there are aches you befriend. "Tell me something about him I don't know," she said to Malik, who was better at making new images than she was. Malik thought. "He cried once, he said. Not like a movie. Quieter. I read something I'd written about my mother working nights. It wasn't even good. But when I looked up, he had that shine in his eyes. He didn't wipe it away like men do when they're trying to keep their faces. He just let it be. Then he said, 'Keep that line about the vending machine.' That's truth." Eleanor closed her eyes and saw it. Her husband, that careful man, letting a piece of himself show to a boy who needed to see a thing like that to trust the world had room for him. When she opened her eyes, the yard was still there, and so were the boys, and so was the ache, softer now. She went inside and brought out a small wooden box. "I should have given you this the day of the sunflowers," she said, passing it to Malik. He opened it to find a key on a thin leather cord. "What's this?" "The key to the carriage house," she said. "I want you to have a place to write when your house is too loud, and Brookview is too full, and the library closes early, because budgets don't come to neighborhoods like yours on time. Use it, and lend it to any boy who needs a quiet that isn't empty." Malik put the cord over his head and let the key rest on his chest, an unflashy metal. "You know," he said after a while, "you're more than I thought." She smiled. So was he. They sat until the mosquitoes convinced them the evening had ended. Later, when the house resumed its newer quiet and the garden kept its more honest watch, Eleanor wrote in the notebook again, filling a page this time without stopping to measure whether each sentence earned its keep. "I used to think wealth was a set of rooms. Now I know wealth is time spent in the right room with the right people. Door open, light on." She tucked the notebook under her pillow like a child with a secret. It turned out secrets could be a comfort when they told the truth. When spring arrived with its permanent surprise, Project 3B expanded to a second room because demand had the decency to be impossible. They trained mentors out of boys who had been students a year before, and the sight of a young man showing a younger one where to put a comma made Eleanor cry in the kitchen without any need to hide it. They added Saturdays. They added a shelf for dictionaries because the internet in some homes had schedules and moods. The city noticed in the way cities do, first with curiosity, then with the impulse to own. Reporters called. Eleanor said, "This is small. We mean it to be a glossy magazine, asked for a photo shoot in the Whitmore garden among the daisies." She said no politely and sent them a photo of Room 3B's bulletin board instead. They declined it. She did not take this personally. On the anniversary that mattered most, she and Malik returned once more to the grave. The caretaker had learned to greet them with a nod that had become a blessing. Eleanor set down daisies again, this time from the garden the boys tended. Malik set down a sunflower, stolen from a store with money and apology. They knelt and did not speak for a long time. When they stood, Eleanor did not feel like she was leaving a person. She felt like she was closing a door to a room that lived now in a different house. On the way back to the car, Malik slipped his arm through hers, the way a son does when he understands love is a verb with 1,000 tenses. "You good?" he asked. "I am," she said, surprised by the whiteness of the truth. They drove the long way home, past the mural, past the school where the principal now sent her texts that read like small psalms. M turned in his essay on time, past the corner store where a boy with a backpack bought a banana and a notebook. The city's two maps overlapped for a moment, like hands clasping, and Eleanor thought, love did not die. It transferred. That evening, Malik gathered the boys in room 3B and read the piece he had finally written, not about Richard, not exactly, but about afternoons in a room where men do not leave and where boys begin. He read the line about the vending machine and the surprise of seeing a man cry. He read the sentence that made Eleanor put her hand to her heart without knowing she had moved it there. Tuesdays teach you the trick of turning a name into a road. When he finished, the boys clapped the way boys do when applause is new. Eleanor did not clap. She stood and said, "All right, back to work." They liked that. Work is what love looks like on the calendar. In the months that followed, the pen signed small checks and big promises. The key turned in the carriage house door. The daisies grew where there had once been mulch that only pretended to be dirt. The Whitmore house filled with the kind of talk that means a place is alive. When Eleanor sat alone, and she still did, because grief is faithful, she did not shrink from the loneliness. She said hello to it like an old friend who had, strange to say, introduced her to many new friends. Sometimes, when the house slept, she would walk to the safe. She kept it now not for money, but for miracles. Inside were new letters. One from Noel, who had lost and then found his voice on a stage he had not known existed. One from a mother simply saying, "Thank you for the Tuesdays." And one from a principal who had learned to ask for help without apology. "Can we extend the program to the girls?" Eleanor wrote back with a check and a promise and a question. What day works for them? On an ordinary Tuesday, the best kind, she arrived at Brookview carrying a box of notebooks. Malik met her at the door with that careful smile of his that always made her think of a young oak tree, sturdy already, but still learning where to put its shade. "You ready?" he asked. "I was late for this my whole life," she said. "I don't intend to be late again." They walked down the hall together, past walls that had learned new colors, toward a room where boys waited with pens and the loudest kind of hope, the quiet kind that sits down and gets to work. Eleanor paused at the door and put a hand against the frame. "Thank you," she whispered. She did not have to say to whom. Then she went in. A life isn't measured by bronze statues or gala dinners, but by the quiet Tuesdays we give to others. This story reminds us, real love is presence, listening, and believing in the good right in front of us. Legacy isn't a nameplate. It's a habit on the calendar, one steady hour each week, sowing belief so someone dares to write their name without shame. Don't wait until loss sends you searching. Ask yourself, who can I be for someone today? Starting this week, choose your own Tuesday. 60 minutes reading with a child, calling someone who's lonely, teaching a small skill, or writing a note of encouragement. If grace has ever found you, pass the pen, give someone else the chance to write their own story. Share below. What Tuesday will you choose? Have you met a quiet mentor before? Name them so we can honor them together. And if this message touched your heart, please subscribe and turn on the bell. Each week, we'll open more Room 3B's spaces of trust, words, and hope together with you. When we trade a showy bouquet for a wild daisy of sincerity, the world softens. Love doesn't disappear. It simply changes hands, from your heart to the next. Tell a friend, leave your promise in the comments, then keep it. Your 1 hour might become someone's first open door.